I arrived at my friend's house on a Saturday afternoon, expecting the usual day of hanging out, maybe watching a movie or talking about school. Instead, they told me they had to run out for a quick errand and would be back shortly. I didn't think much of it and figured I'd just hang out inside until they returned. With some time to kill, I wandered through the house, curious, but feeling comfortable enough to explore a little. Eventually, I drifted into the garage, where I heard the low hum of some tool being used. There, standing by a workbench, was my friend's dad, casually tinkering with something deeply focused. I hadn't seen him up close in a while, and I suddenly noticed little things about him. The way his face seemed calm yet intent, his strong hands working carefully on a task, the slight crease of concentration on his forehead. I smiled and greeted him, expecting a quick nod in return, but he looked up, smiled back warmly, and greeted me with a surprising familiarity. Our casual hello turned into a brief chat, then into a real conversation, as he set his tools down and turned toward me, giving me his full attention. He asked me about school, how things were going, and just everyday stuff that somehow felt more interesting coming from him. There was a casual ease about him that made me feel comfortable, maybe a bit more comfortable than I expected. He had a way of listening that made me feel like what I was saying actually mattered, like he was genuinely interested in hearing my perspective. After a little while, he chuckled, realizing his hands were a bit too full to manage his project alone. Then, in a light-hearted way, he said he could use an extra pair of hands, offering me a spot at his side to help out. It was such a small thing, but something about the invitation made my pulse quicken, just slightly. I told myself it was nothing. He was my friend's dad just being friendly. Still, I couldn't ignore the hint of nervousness I felt as I took up a spot beside him and picked up a tool, ready to follow his lead. We worked together quietly at first, but slowly our conversation picked back up. He showed me how to handle some of the tools, laughing when I fumbled a bit, and I felt the awkwardness quickly turn into a strange sort of teamwork. We were close enough that I could catch a faint whiff of his aftershave mixed with the scent of the wood we were working on, a mix that felt oddly comforting. I noticed little things about him as we worked, the way he'd focus on something, the way he'd smile when I got something right. Every so often, our hands would brush as we passed tools back and forth, and while it seemed accidental, it made my heart skip just slightly each time. I didn't want to read too much into it, but part of me was almost aware of him in a way I hadn't been before. I quickly brushed the thought away, telling myself not to overthink things. I tried to stay focused on what we were doing, ignoring the small flutter of excitement that bubbled up whenever he looked my way. It was harmless, I told myself, just a friendly, innocent moment with someone I respected. And yet, as we laughed and chatted, I couldn't ignore the way something felt just a little different, a little charged, though I kept telling myself it was all in my head. We continued working on the project, the rhythm of our movements becoming familiar, almost synchronized. As he guided me through what to do, I felt my confidence grow, and it seemed like he noticed it too. Occasionally, he would ask questions, simple ones at first about hobbies and school, but soon they felt more personal. He asked what my plans were for the future, what kind of life I envisioned for myself. It surprised me, the depth of his questions, and even more so, how much I wanted to answer. At one point, I caught myself looking at him longer than necessary, watching his focus as he spoke, his hands demonstrating what he was explaining. He looked up and caught my gaze, and I quickly glanced down, embarrassed but oddly thrilled. There was something warm in his smile, something that felt different from the way other adults treated me. It was like he wasn't just humoring me. He genuinely wanted to hear my thoughts, my opinions. As the conversation continued, I started asking him questions too, curious about his life, his career, his experiences. He answered honestly, sharing stories that were unexpectedly candid, not just the usual surface-level small talk. His words hinted at the dreams he'd had, some fulfilled, others left behind as life moved on. For a moment, he seemed more like a person than just a father or an authority figure, and I found myself connecting with him on a level I hadn't anticipated. The air between us began to feel different, subtly charged with something unspoken. Every now and then, our hands would touch as we reached for the same tool, or I'd have to lean closer to hear him over the sound of the project we were working on. Each brush of contact felt slightly more intentional, sending a small thrill through me. I tell myself it was nothing, that it was just the circumstances, but the sensation was there, undeniable. Once, as we were both examining a piece we'd finished, he leaned over my shoulder, close enough that I could feel his breath just behind my ear. A small shiver ran through me, and I struggled to keep my focus on the project, reminding myself over and over that this was innocent, just a friendly gesture, nothing more. Still, it became harder to ignore the subtle hints, the fleeting glances, the small smiles exchanged as if we were both in on a private joke. I started noticing his compliments, small and simple, but each one lingered. When he told me I had a natural talent for this kind of work or that he admired my patience, his words felt genuine, touching something deeper within me. I found myself leaning into the moment, almost savoring each kind word, each nod of approval. I reminded myself that he was just being polite, encouraging, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his words carried an extra layer, something unspoken that hovered just beneath the surface. The minutes felt like they stretched, each one building the tension that neither of us seemed to acknowledge directly. There was an excitement bubbling up in me, but I pushed it down, telling myself not to let my mind wander too far. Yet, each time he smiled or gave me a knowing glance, I felt myself drawn in further, caught between what I knew was right and the thrill of this strange, unexpected connection. As we neared the end of the project, I found myself wishing it could last just a little longer. There was a part of me that didn't want to walk away from this rare connection, from the easy camaraderie we'd slipped into. My mind started wandering, and with it came a flutter of nerves mixed with excitement, feelings that I kept telling myself had no place here. But still, the quiet sense of closeness hung between us, heavy and undeniable. He stepped closer to show me something on the project, and our shoulders brushed, sending a jolt through me that I hoped didn't show on my face. The garage felt smaller, the air thicker, and I couldn't ignore the way my heart started racing as he lingered nearby, pointing out small details, his voice calm but soft. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that these moments didn't mean anything. But as I looked up at him, I felt this pull, an urge to stay close, to let the moment stretch on even though every instinct warned me not to. A silence settled over us, one that seemed filled with things we weren't saying. I felt his eyes on me, and when I looked up, there was something in his expression, a warmth, that made me feel exposed yet exhilarated. For a split second, I wondered if he felt it too, if he was as aware of the tension between us as I was. I knew it wasn't right to think this way. He was my friend's dad, and this was crossing a line I'd never imagined approaching. But that thought seemed to slip away in the quiet of the garage, as if this moment was somehow outside the bounds of what was normal. He cleared his throat and looked away, and I realized I had been holding my breath, waiting, wanting something. I reminded myself that this was dangerous territory, that nothing good could come from letting myself feel this way. Yet, I couldn't deny the thrill it stirred in me, the way my heart raced at the thought of him, of this connection that felt oddly thrilling, if not entirely forbidden. Trying to ground myself, I looked back at the project, forcing my focus to stay on the task at hand. But even as I worked, I was aware of him, of the way his presence seemed to fill the space around us. Every movement, every glance felt charged, like we were both dancing around something unspoken. I knew I should say something to break the tension, to steer things back to where they should be, but the words escaped me. Then he turned to me, his gaze steady, and in that moment, I felt a choice hanging in the air. It was a fleeting pause, but it felt like time had stopped, as if the next move was up to me. I felt torn, caught between the thrill of the moment and the guilt that started creeping in, a reminder of all the reasons this should go no further. I finally broke eye contact, looking down and stepping back, trying to put some distance between us. The reality of the situation hit me all at once. I felt a wave of shame mixed with regret, as if I'd let myself get too close to a line I never should have approached. He cleared his throat again, taking a step back as well, as if sensing that we both needed to break away from whatever had just happened. My cheeks flushed, and I forced a smile, trying to shake off the tension that still lingered. I mumbled something about needing to head out soon, hoping it sounded casual. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, it was as if the closeness we'd felt had never happened. But I knew it had. I could feel it in my racing heartbeat, in the way my mind kept replaying those moments we'd just shared. And as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. A line crossed quietly, leaving me both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. As I left the garage, I couldn't shake the feeling of everything that had just happened. My mind was buzzing with a mix of emotions that left me feeling off balance: guilt, excitement, confusion. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, that nothing truly inappropriate had happened. And yet, the memory of those moments lingered, pulling me back into the feeling of being near him, the charged silence between us, the way he'd looked at me. I tried to focus on anything else, to push the whole experience out of my mind, but the memory felt too vivid, like it had burned into my thoughts. I'd never experienced anything like it before. The thrill of a connection that felt almost secret, something that felt just for us. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was all in my head. But another part of me knew that what I felt was real, and that knowledge left me with a strange sense of longing, even though I knew it was wrong. As the day went on, I found myself replaying our conversation, his subtle compliments, the way he'd listened to me with a kind of attention that felt deeper than I was used to. It was flattering, feeling noticed by someone so self-assured, someone who looked at me in a way that made me feel different, seen, but also admired. I knew he was just being friendly, but I couldn't help but wonder if maybe he'd felt something too. The thought both thrilled and troubled me. A part of me wished I could go back to that moment in the garage, to say something else, to let the connection linger just a bit longer. But I reminded myself of the reality of the situation. He was my friend's dad. That alone was enough reason to put these feelings behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just a momentary attraction, something that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. But deep down I knew I wouldn't forget it. Days passed, and every time I saw my friend, the memory of that afternoon flashed in my mind. I felt a sense of guilt, like I was keeping a secret, even though technically nothing had happened. I kept telling myself that, repeating it like a mantra to ease my conscience. But the feeling didn't go away. Every time I thought back to the garage, it felt real, like a shared moment that was ours alone. Eventually, I decided to let it go, to leave that day as a memory and nothing more. I knew it was best to move on, to keep that experience to myself, a quiet secret that I'd lock away. I'd always remember the thrill, the intensity, but I also knew that it couldn't be more than that. And maybe in a way, that made it even more powerful. Something unspoken, unfinished, something that I'd carry with me, but never act on. In the end, I accepted it for what it was, a fleeting connection, a moment out of place, a memory that would stay with me, both beautiful and bittersweet. And as time went on, I knew I'd remember it less and less. But some part of me would always hold on to it, a reminder of a day when, for just a little while, I'd felt seen in a way I never had before.